So it looks very strange. I didn't know what was going on. Through my translators, I would try to find out what he would do after he went into these trances. Usually he brought back information to help the person that he was going into the trance for. So I went around the world finding these people. This is Linza, she's a shaman in northern Siberia. This is Mengatui, a shaman in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Morgan Yazzie, a medicine man in the Navajo Nation. And this is John Dulikan in a small animistic group right on the Afghan-Pakistan border, one of the last shaman I interviewed. All of them had that very same story. In their adolescence or early childhood, they had what we would call a psychotic break, taken aside by an elder, usually another shaman, and taught how to go in and out of these trance-like states. Well, that was all 14 years ago, and I did not know what to do with this story. It just seemed... If you go a little bit back, please. Right in here? Oh, okay, very good. Sorry about that. So it was about 3 years ago that I was doing a little film on meditation. I met this kid named Adam. And here's a little bit of Adam's story. If we could turn off the lights again.
I was always just very excited. I was just the happy kid. And throughout high school, everything, life was just beautiful. I was 20. It was 4 days after my 20th birthday, I went nuts. So when it first occurred, it was very fun and exciting. It was the first time my mind, it was like this breakthrough. In a weird sense, it was like a breaking of my ego. Then I kept going. And then I went way too far. And then it got scary. It was just kind of like a panic, I don't know, put some medication in this kid and just hope for the best. But I don't know if it hurt or helped. It was at the point where I was being diagnosed, I think, for side effects of medications. Like there was a point where I was taking 15 pills in a day. And just, like, I felt like a lab rat. And the side effects were just awful, absolutely awful.
So that was Adam, and here's the response his parents had.
So he just one day, we were sitting out here, and he started telling us a math equation that would solve all the family's problems. And it was a very simple one, but it made all sense to him, which of course to nobody else. And then he, from there it just escalated to seeing God. So we took him to the hospital, and they put him, from there he was on medication for almost 2 years before he got level.
We could see light at the end of the tunnel, but it really didn't shine bright until after his first initial encounter with meditation. And when he came back from that, there was an obvious major change, just not in his habits, but just in his serenity and his peace of mind.
So, just keep him off. So from there, Adam went 4 years on medication, horrible side effects. He finally actually went cold turkey, quit his meds all of a sudden, and did a Vipassana meditation retreat, which is like it's like the boot camp of meditation. 10 hours a day meditating, 10 days straight, silent meditation, no talking, no looking at anybody in the eye. And he found that to level him somewhat. And then he went on and tried to do another meditation retreat and went through that, and he got even better. When he went back to do the third meditation retreat, they found out about his medical history, his history of mental illness, and they prevented him from going. And from that time on, that was about 2.5 years ago, I've watched him spiral down. He lost his job, he had to quit his job, he became homeless, he decided to move to Hawaii, and in Hawaii, the people do not like homeless people. He got severely beat up, almost killed, knocked most of his teeth out. He's come back home, he's found somewhat of a community. Right now, he is still recovering. Instead of taking pills, he's smoking a lot of marijuana, and that is what's keeping him, he feels, sane right now. So he's got a long way to go, but it's a very common story. So this is the point when he was living in his car. And so what the big tragedy in the United States, anyway, is so many of the people in these extreme states end up either homeless or in prison. Right now, 25% of the homeless have a diagnosable mental illness, and 56% of the people in our prisons. And we have the highest prison population in the world. So it's a real tragedy. So what's been interesting to me as I've looked into this subject is what's happened in the last 30 years. And it was 30 years ago, approximately, that this book came out, The Broken Brain, by Nancy Andreessen, who was the editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry. And even though that was the title of this book, there has never been a biological marker showing somebody in one of these extreme states has any type of chemical imbalance or physical alteration of the brain. It's a myth that has been perpetuated, and it seems like it came about because you could give somebody certain chemicals and change their moods. And so it was assumed there was a lack of this chemical that was causing the problem. Another big thing that happened at that time is the second generation of neuropsychiatric drugs came out. Prozac came out. It was on the cover of Newsweek magazine. Everybody thought this was going to be a new era. We could get rid of our sadness. We could tailor-make our moods to whatever we wanted. And it was widely heralded. But what has happened in that time since that came out, this is what's happened in terms of sales, an 80-fold increase in the number of psychoactive medications have been prescribed. And a lot of them are going to children nowadays. And along with that is if we measure, this is in the United States, our mental disability, if we measure just the Social Security disability insurance for mental illness, that has gone up by almost a factor of 4. So you would think if the medications were the answer, that figure should be going down, if anything, and it's doing quite the opposite. So what is going on?
I was on 2 different...
So I just want to show you this young lady. Her name is Jordan. It's a very typical story. We've interviewed 60, 70 people with lived experience. This is one of them.
I was on 2 different antidepressants. My doctor had prescribed me it was a paper with 6 questions on it, and you answer them, and the point system that they use to score it, depending on how many points you get, is the severity of your mental disorder, anxiety, depression. I scored like severe depression, severe anxiety, all this, and she told me, you're gonna need these. You can't get over depression on your own. Once someone's depressed, they will be for the rest of their life. It's like, oh man, my life sucks, and oh gosh, it's gonna be like this for the rest of my life, you know? And dwelling on that was what really brought me down.
So what got her into the psychiatric office is she was a young girl waiting tables. She came out, she saw she had a table of 12 people. She panicked, ran back in the kitchen, started crying, and that ended her up in the hospital and with this diagnosis. She now manages that same restaurant. So here's a collage we put together of just people we've interviewed.
Schizophrenia, schizotypal, schizoid personality, schizoaffective, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, major depression,
homicidal ideation, bipolar, ADHD, ODD, depression and anxiety.
Borderline personality, they put autism, they put Asperger's, they put manic depressive. I didn't think I was that.
Manic depression, bipolar 1, and just one time schizoaffective.
in the era of the DSM-3, there were like 12 personality disorders, and I had 8 of them, and the perfectionist in me wanted to try and get all 12.
Abilify, lithium, Equitro, Ativan, Zyprexa, Symbyax, Prozac, Effexor, Wellbutrin,
Ativan, Vyvanse, Concerta, Ritalin, Adderall, Imipramine, Desipramine,
Delazine, Navane, Imipramine, Sinequan, Benadryl, Cogentin, Artane, Valium, and when I went into a hospital, they would add Thorazine, Haldol, Prolixin, Meloril, and anything else that they had the mood for.
Risperdal, Halidol, many. Like I said, I counted at one time 24 medications.
At one point, they had me on 26 different medications, and multiple times a day. Unfortunately, with audit, I can't remember all of them. Some of them were like Trazodone, Seroquel. The doctor overdosed me by accident by prescribing too many at one time. And I was talking to a cute girl in class, flopped over, foamed at the mouth, and can't remember 3 days of my life.
So that was a sampling of some of the people we've interviewed. And here's, in this whole search for help for Adam, I found this whole underground or grassroots movement of people that are asking for change. Usually people with lived experience, and one of the leaders in that movement is a guy named Will Hall. He'll be one of the subjects or main characters in our film when we're done. And here's what he has to say.
The diagnosis process, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is basically a sophisticated way of not listening to people. You interview just so that you've heard certain keywords, you fit it into your framework, and then you've got a whole algorithm of treatments that you offer people so that when your colleagues and your supervisors ask you, what are you doing to this person, you're following the protocol. But the problem is that we've misapplied a medical model into a relational and human and emotional context.
A sophisticated way of not listening. I really love that line. So the movement, this underground movement, it looks like I've got to get further into the corner here. A call for alternatives, mainly by people with lived experience. And it's really been fueled, and Sean Blackwell is definitely an example of this, by the online communities where people have been able to now get together, compare notes, and talk to one another. And it's been a huge support for this call to take a second look at this biomedical approach that has dominated us for at least the last 30 years. Open Dialog, which I won't go into because most of you know a lot about, came out of northern Finland. And again, deep listening. You talk to the people in Open Dialog, they say, the thing we've got to teach people is to drop the clinical gaze. Look at that person as a human being and not be looking for the diagnosis. peer support, that's gaining great traction. I'm finding, right now I'm doing a story of a young woman in New York City, and New York is actually passing credentialed tests for the peers. So they're going to be credentialed and welcomed into the healing community, people with lived experience. Narrative therapy. And narrative therapy, it comes out of Australia. It's a new one I've just learned about. And they actually, to get around the labeling, you know, how do you get around these stigmatized labels when you have to deal with insurance companies and get paid for what you're doing? They actually just give the list of possible diagnosis to the patient and say, here, you choose. You're just as good as I at choosing these. And just to let the patient know that they have the power. And so of all the things we've heard, the number one, Karen said it, I've heard it a million times, I wish I had hope, had been given hope. It's usually, you've got a broken brain, this is a lifelong illness, there's really no cure, these are the meds that'll keep you relatively sane for the rest of your life. And no hope for recovery. The other big one is trust in myself. I lost all trust in myself. Karen said, when I was happy, I felt, oh my God, I may be getting sick again. Just losing that trust is such a huge issue. And that was a big one that we've heard over and over again. And meaning. Anybody can get through something if they know there's some meaning behind it. And this is usually not, it's just you're unlucky, you got struck down by this random disease, and it's just too bad, but this is the way it is. There's no real, this is a process of growth, this is an issue that you can deal with, and so.
I was diagnosed as...
I'll start this. This is a young woman I just heard at a conference that opened with a keynote, much like Karen did. And she had her break when she was 13 years old. She looked in the mirror, and she was a straight A student, high performer in a very professional family. She looked in the mirror, and she saw a total stranger. And she'd never had this experience before. And she ended up, oh, well, here's her story.
I was diagnosed as a 14-year-old, and I was put on psychiatric drugs at that time and took them until the age of 27. My first label was bipolar disorder, and then I'd also be labeled with major depression, social anxiety disorder, borderline personality disorder, substance abuse disorder. One of the biggest lessons that I was taught by the system was to surrender faith in myself. And really for me that meant, once I internalized a mentally ill identity, once I came to see myself as having this disease living inside of me, I stopped trusting in my intuition because it was sick with it. And to me there's no greater betrayal than to be stripped of your right to believe in yourself and to trust in your intuition and to trust in your emotions and your mind. Anytime I was struggling, I would panic. I'd say, oh my God, my symptoms are coming up. I need to do something about it. I need to get rid of them. And what I did come to realize was, wait a minute, my suffering is incredibly meaningful. It's here for a reason, and I have to stop running away from it. And I realized, I have the only way to find myself again and to get back to an authentic sense of self is to feel all of this and to listen to it and to explore it and to not be afraid of it. So that's what I started to do.
Very bright girl. During that period of medication, she managed to go through high school, graduate, and get into Harvard. And she finally came off her meds when she was 27. She came across Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic. I don't know, has anybody heard of that book here? I don't know how popular it is in Europe. So what is going back to my roots, indigenous people, what is the shaman's advantage over somebody in Western culture? First, they get a positive framing of what's going on for them. They're told it's a gift. It's not a disease. You're unique. You have a unique ability here, and it needs to be honed and taken care of. It's not stigmatized. Try to get a job. Karen, I'm constantly mentioning you, but you told us last night that you've got to keep your background off your application to a college, Berkeley, for getting a degree in psychology. If you put that I had this episode, they wouldn't let you in. I couldn't believe, how insane that is. But that's what's happening. The stigmatization is try to get a job with a schizophrenia diagnosis written on your application. They believe the crisis begins a process of development. It isn't just symptoms without a reason. And they get a mentor. They get a person with lived experience to walk them through, somebody that can let them trust in what they're going through. And finally, they have a community that honors them after they've gone through this. They become very respected people in the community. And I must say, yes, I haven't done a thorough study of this. I've only met the shamans. I haven't met any insane people in these communities that did not become shaman and were just left to live on the streets. But it does tell you something that does work with somebody in that set of circumstances. This is the last person I want to talk a little bit about. She's another subject in our film. Her name is Akia, and she has a very interesting story, and I'll let her start off the story.
This is, in kindergarten, and although I'm smiling, in my eyes I see sadness, because this was around the time when my father started molesting me. So it's a bittersweet picture. I was always quiet and isolated. Half the time, and the other time I was very angry. So I remember one time I was on the school bus and there was a child being picked on, and I attacked the other child that was the bully to stand up for the kid, because I wanted someone to do that for me. My life was just really rock bottom. I hit rock bottom. I dealt with depression for a huge part of my life. I decided I did not know why I was living on this earth. I had no clue. I didn't feel deserving of love, of anything. Then I started to have intense visions. I started to see my deceased father, and he would show up in my room. And really, it was the scariest thing that I've ever experienced. And I could feel it. I could feel him first, and then I would just see him appear. I decided to try to get some kind of help. And there was a hospital near me, New York Presbyterian Hospital. I was put on several different medications, about 4 or 5 different really heavy drugs, antipsychotics, and it really changed who I was completely. I gained 70 pounds in the first 2.5 months of being on the medications.
So she went into the hospital, got that diagnosis. Then she had several suicide attempts. Her story goes on and on, but she finally ran into a peer-to-peer support center in New York City called Baltic Street, and that started to help her. And she moved along so well, they actually hired her to be peer support for others, and that really accelerated her healing. But then she met a Sangoma, which is a South African shaman woman living close by. She lives in New York, and this person was down in Baltimore. And she started studying with that person, And that really gave her a whole different level, on a spiritual level, of healing. And here's what she has to say about it.
The Sangoma training involves humbling yourself completely to your teacher and to your ancestors. So everything that I do, I must do on my knees. If I'm speaking to my teacher or to someone, I must be on my knees when doing so, unless I'm at work, because of the rituals and the ceremonies and going through the process of the Sangoma training and the protocols that I have to go through. All those things have made me so much stronger and helped me to realize my true power and has put me in touch with my higher self. I learned other ways to cope. I learned how to face my problems and deal with them on a different level, a spiritual level. That is what's really healed me. That's what's really brought me to a level of true understanding why all the problems that I was experiencing and what they meant.
And this is what she has to say just recently.
Finally, I know why I'm on this earth. I know why I'm so sensitive to all these things and energies. I understand why I have visions now. I understand, and no one, I had to go find it. You tell your therapist or your psychiatrist and they say you're ill. They say you have an issue. You have borderline personality disorder. You have chronic depression. And these are the drugs that you need to take. This is what's going to help you. But nobody told me this is a spiritual matter. And you are gifted. And now it's time for you to hone these gifts. And it was just so amazing. I'm so grateful because it has changed my life. I know who I am without a doubt, 100%. I know who I am. And it is the best feeling ever. I have a purpose and I have a reason to live. And the reason is the best reason that God could ever give is to help humanity. Help other people that have experienced the things that I have experienced. To connect with Earth, to connect with this universe. It is magical. And I am so grateful.
So Akia, this week, during this whole episode of depression and crisis she had 3 children. She had to leave her family. This week, she is going back to see her 3 kids that she hasn't seen since she was in the depths of that depression. So the shaman, back to the shaman again, there's a resistance. That was the other thing I learned from all these people. They don't want to, once they get this calling, they call it the calling, it comes in this way, nobody wants it. And they don't necessarily want to be a shaman. It isn't like they're raising their hand to go to shaman school. It's like it comes upon them, it's a calling. And whatever they were doing, Sakulan, the woman in Africa, has 5 children. She still has to raise her 5 children, but now she's the healer in the community. And by the way, they don't charge for their services. So it's just another added duty. The other thing is that it involves a surrender. So they go through this initiation, and it's a surrender to them to a higher power than their ego consciousness. And we've heard that many times in the 12-step program. The initiation is very, very difficult. It's like Akia told me that her initiation was more difficult than her original illness. And it was going inside and re-experiencing many of the things that she had been through. So the big question, and Sean and I were talking about this last night, is this, in the transpersonal psychology world, this is known as a spiritual awakening. Stan Groff and his wife coined that term. Is this a spiritual awakening? And I guess that's where we are in the film. We're looking at this. Is there anything spiritual to this? And what does the word spiritual even mean? Is it an emergency? Is it a spiritual emergency? So, You know, a lot of what I've learned in terms of quote-unquote spiritual is from the Tibetan people. And this is a Tibetan nun in Tibet. On her back is a bag of sampa, ground barley flour. That is her year's supply of food as she goes into a cave to meditate for a year. And so they take the whole mindfulness, meditation equation to a new level. I was in Tibet a couple of years ago doing a book, and I met this monk, and he said, I'm going up to give some food to a woman who's 90 years old. She went into the cave to meditate when she was 12. She had been meditating for 78 years. And I said, can I go and meet this woman? So we got up to the door of the cave, and he said, I don't think you better go in. So I just gave him my camera, and he went in and got a shot of her in this cave. But they, again, the Tibetans take looking at the mind, looking at the conscious rattling, the monkey brain, and looking within at such a level that it is just quite amazing. The other thing they do is they have all these rituals. They prostrate as they go around their sacred mountains. And I met this group of people who were prostrating, which means you lie down on the ground, stretch your hands out, walk to the tips of your fingers, stand up and do it again. Like an inchworm, they move along. They were in eastern Tibet. They were going all the way to Lhasa, 1,500 miles away. And this is not only over flat road, it's over mountain peaks and everything else. And so I asked them, why? Why do you do this? And they said, to get rid of self-cherishing, to get rid of that feeling, I'm the right one, I'm the most important. And they end up with calluses on their foreheads from touching the ground. And so they make this an extreme practice of getting rid of that. So in talking to them and thinking about this whole thing, if you took and talked about spirituality, what is spirituality? It's a path to me. It's not a static thing, it's a movement. And we're all on that movement to a certain degree, according to many people in the Buddhist community and other communities, going from ignorance to enlightenment, or a feeling of being totally separate. You could think of a psychopath that doesn't care about anybody else but themselves, in that complete separate place, to a place where you realize you're just one with everything. And anywhere along that path is that spiritual movement. Either you could say in psychological terms, from an ego identity, a separate identity, to a spiritual identity. And the thing that propels it for the Tibetans is the practice of compassion. You ask the Dalai Lama, what's your religion? He says, it's simple. It's just the practice of kindness. That's what it is. It's not that difficult. The thing that goes the other way and pushes the other way to the Tibetans is that self-grasping. I'm the most important. I've got to protect myself. And so I'll just close with one of my favorite quotes by not a spiritual person, not thought of as a spiritual person, thought of as one of our most brilliant scientists. We human beings tend to experience ourselves as something separate from the whole we call the universe. This is actually an optical delusion of our consciousness, and it's like a prison for us. Our task is to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. This path to our liberation is the only true foundation for our inner peace and security. That's Albert Einstein. So thank you very much. And oh, by the way, I guess Rude, you wanted me to announce, if anybody wanted to talk about this subject a little bit more, we'll be doing a workshop later on. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil Borges. Very interesting lecture. You were very critical on psychiatry. And I would like to comment on that, but I will do it later. I'll wholeheartedly acknowledge, of course, the hope, the trust, and the meaning. I think that's very important.
And by the way, I am not anti-psychiatric or anti-med. I hope I didn't convey that meaning. I have very much respect.
Yeah. Of course, I think you can say that disease is a gift, but I would like to add it's a dangerous gift.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. We hebben een korte pauze tot 11:10. Dan zie ik u graag terug.